Before I begin, I'd like to preemptively apologize for how shit the visual portion of this video is. I wanted to make sure I used nothing but my own footage, but I can't justify buying a capture card at the moment, so I just recorded some footage of the game running on my PVM. It looks like ass, but if you're as horny for CRTs as I am, you still might get a kick out of it. Ninja Gaiden Black occupies a strange space in gaming. It's considered one of the greatest action games of all time, yet it hasn't had nearly as much staying power as practically all of its contemporaries. And that might be because on the surface, it's a fairly standard action game. It doesn't have some bizarre attention-grabbing premise or insane expressive mechanics. And I think this leads newcomers to the game to focus on what it lacks, things like on-the-fly weapon switching or a hard lock-on, rather than try to uncover what makes the game truly special. While it may seem humble compared to modern titles, A Journey Down the Higher Difficulties reveals a unique approach to action that in a lot of ways is still unmatched, even 15 years later. Movement is one of the key components of Ninja Gaiden. Enemies are absurdly fast and aggressive, and if you don't have amazing control over all of Ryu's mobility options, you won't last very long. The most important thing to master is the roll jump. Ryu can perform a defensive roll in one direction and then chain that into a jump in any other direction. Roll jumps serve a number of functions: canceling out of the guard break animation or just avoiding attacks altogether, gaining a positional advantage, and allowing you to perform an on-landing move. Those first ones are self-explanatory, but on-landing moves are, as far as I'm aware, totally unique to Ninja Gaiden. These are certain attacks which can only be performed for a few frames after you land on the ground. Keep in mind that while roll jumps are the most commonly used way to perform on-landing moves, simply touching the ground after any kind of fall puts Ryu in the on-landing state. Holding Y during on-landing frames also skips the startup animation that takes place when charging essence techniques and ultimate techniques, which I'll be calling ETs and UTs from now on. These are your weapon's most powerful attacks, so naturally you're going to want to use them as often as possible on higher difficulties. Charging them normally leaves you wide open though, so skipping that charge state by using your on-landing frames is absolutely essential. Because of on-landing frames, roll jumps are simultaneously a defensive and offensive action, and the way the game blends those two elements of combat together is one of its most unique qualities. There's quite a bit more to ETs and UTs than mastering on-landing frames, though. They can be charged simply by holding the Y button, but it's so slow it's almost always unviable. After an enemy has been killed, they'll drop one of three kinds of essence orbs: yellow, which gives you money, blue, which refills health, and red, which refills ninpo. If any of these orbs are present while you're charging an attack, your weapon will absorb them and you'll be able to perform either an ET or a UT. If you absorb a single yellow essence, you'll get an ET, which is weaker, and if you absorb two or more yellow essence, a blue essence, or a red essence, you'll get a UT. However, using a blue or red essence to charge an attack will not give you any health or ninpo back, and using a yellow only gives you a small amount of money. So each ET and UT comes with a heavy price, especially when you consider that unlike the game's sequel, getting hit while charging knocks you out of the charge state, meaning you've just wasted essence for nothing. It's a high-stakes gamble that you're making several times an encounter, which needless to say gives the game a lot of fantastic tension. They're also a part of the reason I'm glad this game doesn't have a New Game Plus feature. In other action games with New Game Plus, since you can carry over upgrades between playthroughs, eventually you reach a point where money stops mattering. But money has to matter in NGB. With each ET and UT, you're asking yourself, what do I need more right now, money or damage? And that can often be a very difficult, interesting decision, which wouldn't be present if the game had New Game Plus. Another key aspect of using Essence is something called Essence chaining. Essence stays active on screen for around 10 seconds, and no matter how far away from it you are, as long as that 10 seconds isn't up, you'll be able to absorb it. Being able to use an ET or UT as soon as a fight begins is an incredible advantage, so chaining is very important. Ryu automatically absorbs any essence that's within a certain range of him, which can be problematic if you're trying to chain it into the next fight. To avoid this, you can just hold the block button, which will prevent Ryu from absorbing it. Giving a single button too many distinct functions like this could obviously become a problem, but because NGB is such a defensively focused game, the block button is something you're going to be holding down almost constantly, regardless of if you're trying to chain essence or not, so it doesn't cause any issues. It also has the nice side effect of forcing players who block excessively to stop and put themselves at risk in order to get any nearby essence they might need. And while I'm talking about extra functions of the block button, it's also worth noting that even while holding block, you're still able to use aerial attacks and projectiles, and can even use on-landing moves. So like I was saying earlier, playing defensively and playing offensively are really one and the same thing king here. Holding block doesn't rob you of your entire arsenal, and this makes essence chaining much smoother and easier. It's a great system in general. In a lot of action games, encounters can often feel isolated from one another, but because of essence chaining, you have to view each fight in NGB as a piece of a larger picture, and the time limit on essence means you have to learn how to traverse each level as efficiently as possible. I've talked a lot about ETs and UTs so far, but this is of course just a small part of Ryu's moveset. NGB has a large variety of weapons, each with their own unique combo strings. However, this is also where a lot of the game's most obvious shortcomings start to appear. The main weapon, the Dragon Sword, is a great all-rounder with speed, range, and damage that makes it viable in practically every scenario the game throws at you. In addition, it also has access to one of the best attacks in the game, Windmill Slash, which is a short roll ending with an attack. While it doesn't have as many iframes as a regular roll, it still has enough to make it a fantastic tool to interrupt attacks and quickly punish foes. Once you get used to it, you never want to be without it again. Combine this with the painfully slow process of going into the menu, and weapon swapping in NGB just isn't very well incentivized. Until that is, you start to play beyond normal difficulty. As soon as you hit hard, experimentation with weapons becomes practically a requirement. Arguably, the second best weapon in the game is the Lunar, which has a lower damage output to the Dragon Sword, but its incredible range makes it ideal for crowd control. The nunchucks and flail have a very short range, but they have incredible speed and can easily wall-splat opponents, making them great for encounters in tight spaces. The heavy weapons are what you would imagine, incredibly slow but deal loads of damage, and are best used against slower enemy types like ogres and berserkers. While each weapon subtype fills its own niche very well, there's not nearly enough differentiation between each weapon in those subtypes. The flail has a few more moves than the nunchucks, plus the ability to decapitate enemies, so the only reason you would ever pick the nunchucks is if you're trying to make the game harder for yourself. Similarly, the Debilero has more useful moves and is more powerful than both the Warhammer and the Dark Dragon Blade. The Kitetsu is a decent alternative to the Dragon Sword thanks to its unique health drain mechanic, but it still isn't as versatile a weapon. Another shortcoming is the dial combos themselves. While there are plenty of these combos that have clear and distinct applications, many are fairly redundant. Aside from slight differences in damage output and recovery time, many moves perform the same functions, and this leads to a move list that feels unnecessarily bloated. Projectile weapons are less problematic. The default projectiles are the Shuriken, which you might suspect are this game's equivalent to Ebony and Ivory from DMC, whose function is largely to just maintain combos rather than deal damage. And while they do fill this role, Shuriken are primarily used to interrupt enemy attacks, extend your airtime, and Shuriken cancel, a technique where you throw out a shuriken to cancel the recovery animation on an attack. Shuriken canceling is handy in a few situations, but it isn't exactly a crucial technique to learn. A projectile that you definitely do need to understand, though, are smoke bombs. These briefly confuse enemies and allow you to get some free hits in. They're a limited use item that costs you money to refill, so it can be tempting to never use them and just save the cash. But when fighting against large crowds, they can absolutely make the difference between success and failure. Smoke bombs also get enemies to drop their defense, so they're a great strategy against opponents that block very often. And lastly, dropping a smoke bomb causes Ryu to roll in any direction you choose, so they're a good mobility tool as well. The worst projectile weapon is easily the bow. Ryu's third-person auto-aim is horrendous, so if you want to actually hit anything, you need to aim in first person. The biggest problem with this is that when transitioning to first person, your view snaps to wherever Ryu is currently facing, not the nearest target. From there, aiming is slow and leaves you totally vulnerable. To top it all off, there isn't even a crosshair on the weapon itself, turning aiming into a pain. It's a slow, clunky mess that's almost never worth the effort outside of the few encounters where using it is required. Putting first-person weapons into third-person action games isn't a fundamentally bad idea, however. Transformers Devastation is a good example of how to integrate those two concepts well. Whipping out a gun in that game is lightning fast, immediately targets the closest enemy, and can even trigger a vehicle attack, meaning guns can be incorporated into your basic melee combos. The bow weapon could have been a fun tool, but its execution leaves a lot to be desired. The enemy design, on the other hand, is phenomenal. Ninja Gaiden Black features a frankly absurd amount of enemy types. The catch is that most won't be encountered on a single playthrough. In a lot of action games, higher difficulty levels remix the enemy placement so that weaker enemy types are fought less often. NGB takes this a step further by introducing brand new enemies that will only appear on higher difficulties. To be fair, the majority of them are reworked versions of different enemies with just a few additions and a different model, but even they have enough differences to change the way encounters play out. For example, the silver soldiers that replace the green soldiers have the unique ability to snipe you out of the air if you try to use Flying Swallow on them, and the crow shadow demons guard break you with almost every attack. Even the mage enemies, which appear to be the same across all difficulties, have a different fireball with a significantly larger hitbox. While there is plenty of enemy variety, very often you're only pitted against one enemy type at a time, which is a real shame. To make up for it, most enemy types have a ranged attack in addition to melee attacks, so that they can fill a supporting role, which is fine, but it isn't as interesting as fighting an enemy that's specifically designed to be in a supporting role. For example, the previously mentioned mage enemies exist to annoy and distract you from the main threat, which is the samurai. They teleport around all over the place and can shoot you from off screen, so when fighting the samurai, you still need to pay attention to them and their audio cues. Having to juggle two distinct challenges like that is obviously way more engaging than only dealing with one, so it's weird to me that the game usually doesn't make you do that. However, even if you're fighting the same enemy types over and over again, the game uses the level design to keep things fresh. Being aware of your surroundings is obviously a component of any action game, but it's significantly more important here than in most other games of the genre. Because of NGB's reliance on things like roll jumping, wall attacks, and wall splats, the space you're in has a very large impact on how you approach an encounter. Fighting 3 ninjas in an open arena and fighting 3 ninjas in a cramped alleyway are two very different things, and that's not something you can really say about a lot of action games. Another great inclusion that separates NGB from its peers is that almost every enemy has some kind of multi-hit combo. Even in Bayonetta, a game known for having incredibly aggressive enemies, the most basic enemy types, applauds, can't combo you at all. As you ratchet up the difficulty, that doesn't change, they just become more aggressive. Contrast this with NGB, where even the very first enemy type on normal has a basic 2-hit combo, and on Master Ninja they're replaced with ones that have a 2-hit combo that can knock you out of the air, a 4-hit combo that guard breaks you, and exploding projectiles. Enemies in NGB are way more threatening than your average action game enemy. Their speed, aggression, and large movesets make them incredibly hard to predict, especially when dealing with 3 to 5 of them at a time. They can easily overwhelm you, which is why moves like Wind Path are so useful. Wind Path is this game's equivalent to Enemy Step from DMC, but Wind Path has a very different function which I think best illustrates the differences between these two series. Enemy Step exists so that you can create and maintain complex and flashy air combos. Wind Path exists so that you can get enemies away from you. Using Wind Path stuns enemies for quite a while and also puts a lot of distance between you and them. It's great if you just want to create space, but you can also use the on-landing frames you get after a successful Wind Path to set up an easy UT. Guillotine Throw is a similarly useful technique which doesn't do much damage and is a bit too finicky to perform consistently, but creates space and can wall splat them. Enemies love to gang up on you, so finding ways to get them off and stun them is an incredibly important part of the combat system. The phenomenal enemy design leads to some very dynamic encounters, which is something that's lacking from the game's boss fights. Usually they involve waiting for the boss to perform a specific attack, exploiting their opening using one specific combo, and then repeating that process until they die. Ninja Gaiden just isn't a game built for one-on-one fights. The dynamism of regular encounters comes from the fact that you're always being faced against several enemies at once. They're so fast and unpredictable that you always have to think on your feet and improvise. When you're facing just one opponent, this improvisational element is gone. Thankfully, this is only really a problem on Ninja Dog and normal difficulty. From hard onwards, the game throws in extra enemies during boss fights that respawn every time you take 25% off the boss's life bar. This doesn't fully solve the issue, since once you kill the added enemies, you still have to fight a fairly boring boss. But the extra challenge of having to take on minions while avoiding highly damaging boss attacks is a very engaging one, which goes a long way in improving these fights. There are still plenty of duds though, like the tank and helicopter bosses, that can only be damaged using the game's worst weapon, the bow. They're not totally worthless inclusions, as they're a decent test of your ability to play defensively, but limiting your offensive options to such an already limited weapon feels extremely out of place. Overall, the bosses allow for some occasionally brilliant moments, but are still fairly flawed. Speaking of flawed, it's time to talk about the game's coolest weapon, the Unlabored Flawlessness, a secret weapon you get by fully upgrading the wooden sword. It's a weapon that becomes stronger the closer you are to death. Even on Master Ninja difficulty, almost everything can be killed in just a few hits with the fully powered up Unlabored Flawlessness. With how lethal NGB's combat is, mastering the weapon is one of the most difficult tasks in the entire game. It's a fantastic risk versus reward weapon, and there isn't a whole lot to say about it other than that. The reason I give it its own section here is because it exemplifies a lot of what makes the combat system so special. Action and arcade games tend to push players toward perfection. Any mistake means a less than perfect rank at the end, so you need to reset with every failure. This can have the side effect of making certain things like health bars irrelevant. You can spend hours hunting down every life upgrade in a platinum game, but how useful is that when the ranking system expects you to start a fight over every time you take a hit? In contrast, NGB is a game that begs you to get hit. Being at low health not only powers up the Unlabored Flawlessness, It also increases the likelihood of enemies dropping blue essence. This is fantastic for a few reasons. More blue essence means more UTs, so by risking death you can get fights over quicker. It also discourages you from using your healing items. If you get knocked down to say half health, instead of immediately popping an expensive health potion, you might just continue on and take a little bit more damage. That way enemies start to drop blue essence, which gives you that health back for free. It's a system that encourages you to put yourself at incredible risk, allowing for the kinds of crazy clutch moments and comebacks that you won't find in many other action games. Lastly, I'd like to focus on a weirdly under-discussed aspect of the game, the scoring system. The obvious problem with it is that there's no tangible reward for scoring well, which I guess is why most people don't pay attention to it, but there's a lot of cool stuff going on under the hood here. Individual fights are ranked based on combo, kill count, and time. Time is the most important thing to focus on as it gives you the largest point bonus, which is 10,000 per fight. You also get 2,000 points for every ET and 5,000 points for every UT that connects while the timer is still active. And the points you get from each kill depends on how much time is left on the clock when the fight is over. So the basic idea is to kill everything as quickly as possible while using as many ETs and UTs as possible. Your combo count is unfortunately pretty irrelevant when it comes to score. That's because the way it's calculated is by taking the final count and multiplying it by 10, meaning in order to have a combo give you as many points as a single UT, you would need to have a 500 hit combo, and that just is not feasible. The scoring system is very focused on ETs and UTs, which I don't think is the worst thing in the world. It might make high score runs look boring if you're unfamiliar with the game, but UTs are extremely high risk moves that take a considerable amount of skill to pull off consistently. That being said, I think I would have preferred a system where the amount of points you gained for each ET and UT was multiplied based on the number of hits in your current combo. That way, maintaining a high combo count wouldn't be as low of a priority as it is now. Individual fights aren't the only part of the scoring system though. There's also the end of chapter bonuses. You get extra points based on the total chapter time, total kills, essence, and ninpo. Time and kills are self-explanatory, but essence is a little weird. The way it works is that if you want the full point bonus, you need to end the chapter with 2,000 more essence than what you started with. This introduces a really bizarre but interesting management challenge that pushes you to limit your spending as much as possible and collect enough yellow essence to make up for whatever you do end up buying. It's a really cool idea that I can't say I've seen anywhere else, but it does have one critical flaw. If you enter a chapter with 98,000 essence or more, it will be impossible to get the full bonus since you can only have 99,999 essence at a time. Now, getting that amount of money is pretty difficult and you can always just spend it before the chapter ends, but it's still a glaring oversight. The last piece of the scoring system to mention is ninpo. I've neglected the ninpo system up to this point, and that's because there's really nothing I can say about it that hasn't already been said. They're very straightforward and uninteresting attacks, and the fact that the game outright rewards you for not engaging with them should tell you everything you need to know about them. Now technically, the game doesn't actually track if you use ninpo during a chapter, it just awards points based on how many of your ninpo slots are filled at the end. So you can abuse ninpo all you want as long as you use items to refill your slots before the end of the chapter. However, this becomes harder the higher the difficulty level is, because after normal, the devil elixirs get more and more expensive, the game stops giving them to you for free, and the max amount you can carry is significantly reduced. The scoring system has a lot of problems, but the one thing I really love about it compared to other action games is that it allows you to be a little sloppy. For example, in most Platinum games, fights are scored using 3 distinct metrics: combo, damage, and time. Failing a single one during any fight means you either have to reset or accept a lower rank. But there's only one category that matters in Ninja Gaiden: your total karma points. Even on Master Ninja, you can fail multiple time bonuses, but still be awarded the highest rank as long as you make up for those lost points in some other category. I don't think that demanding perfection from players is necessarily a bad thing, but when your game is like 10 hours long, it starts to get a little exhausting. You still have to play very well to get high ranks in Ninja Gaiden, but you don't have to be flawless. That way, rank chasing isn't quite as emotionally draining as it is in other action games. And if you're someone who wants to push themselves and be perfect, you can always try going after the world record. So basically, what I've been trying to say is, Ninja Gaiden Black is the coolest fucking game. The skill ceiling may not be as high as some of its contemporaries, but the skill floor is significantly higher. It demands so much of you that reaching a point of basic consistency seems like an impossible dream. And for that reason, I've found it very difficult to get tired of it. I've noticed that I tend to get burnt out on action games somewhere around the 100-hour mark, but I've been playing NGB non-stop for the past 6 months, and I'm still loving every second of it. Fights are beautiful, chaotic disasters where you're bouncing all over the place, using all the space you're given in ways that you just can't in other games. You may have certain strategies in mind beforehand, but something will always go wrong. It's a game that demands you think on your feet. It may seem simplistic on the surface, but you really owe it to yourself to dig a little deeper. If you put in the work, you'll discover one of the most engaging and unique combat systems, period. Also, shout out to the guy in the credits whose name is just MSM03GOG. I never thought I'd come across another person who fits the hyper-specific criteria of Ninja Gaiden player that named themselves after the best amphibious mobile suit, but here we are.